In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the new landscape layers to paint textures. In the previous tutorial, we covered how to use the sculpting tools with the landscape layers. So make sure you watch that video first, because that video covers a lot of essential information you need to get started with using landscape layers. So in Unreal Engine 4.24 and later, we were introduced to a new feature called landscape layers. This means you can now edit and modify your landscape non-destructively. There's two components to landscape layers. Each landscape layer can contain information for the heightmap sculpt, which we covered in the previous video, and it can contain painted textures, and that's what we're going to cover in this video. Here I have a landscape that does not have any landscape material applied onto it yet. If I switch over to landscape mode, and under sculpt menu, we have our layers we created in the previous video that contain specific sculpted information within each layer. And if I switch over to paint, we have the same layers, and in each of these layers can also hold painted texture information on your landscape. So we have the sculpt information under sculpt menu, and we have painted texture information under paint menu. So let's apply a material onto our landscape. I'm going to open up a new content browser so you can see better. And I already have a landscape material created. So I'm going to go inside that folder, and it's this material right here. I'm going to open it up and quickly show you what it is. This is a very simple 4-paint layer material that uses starter content textures. I have 4 color textures and 4 normal map textures. Then I have a landscape coordinate node with a map and scale set to 5, and this node is connected into each texture UV input, so the tiling of each texture is a bit larger. And then to create the ability to paint your textures on the landscape, I have a layer blend node. And then I also have a constant vector set to 0 for metallic and 0.9 plugged into roughness. Now for the layer blend node, I already have 4 layers, 1 for each texture. And each layer, the blend type, is set to LB weight blend. This is the most commonly used blend type, and it's the default. This is going to be very important a little later in the tutorial. So if I insert a layer blend node and create a new layer, you can see that it uses the default blend type, LB weight blend. So this is a very simple material that we're going to use for the example of this tutorial. But if you want to know how to create landscape materials that go beyond what we have here and actually make your materials look good on your landscapes, I cover that in the second module of UE4 Landscape Essentials course. So I highly recommend that you take a look at that. Let's go ahead, hit apply, and save. We now need to apply the material onto the landscape. So I'm going to select the landscape, go into the details panel, scroll down. Under landscape material, we need to plug in our material right into this slot. So I'm going to go back into content browser, select our material, and then back in details panel, I'm going to assign the selected material from the content browser. Our landscape will turn black, and this is completely normal. This is because we do not have any layer info created and assigned to the landscape. Let's switch over to landscape mode and go into paint menu. We have our landscape layers here, which again were created in the previous video during the sculpt section. And since we are inside the paint menu, they do not contain any painting texture information. And anytime you create a new layer, it will appear in both menus. But the information kept inside each layer will be separate. And then if we scroll further down, under target layers, we have our 4 layer textures. So in order to be able to paint texture layers on your landscape, you must create layer info for each layer you see here. And actually, let me pull this off so you can see this better. For each layer, you must create layer info by clicking on this plus icon. And you will have an option to create weight blended layer normal or non-weight blended layer. And the one you choose will depend on the blend type you have set for each layer inside the material editor. So if I go back inside the material editor, select the layer blend node, and under blend type for each layer, we have these 3 options. And whichever one you have set here will determine which layer info you create. Now, it's outside the scope of this tutorial to explain each blend type, what it does, and the two different layer infos. I do cover this in the course in detail, so if you haven't gone through the course yet, highly recommend you pick this up, because understanding the blend type and the layer info is very important to creating and working with materials for landscapes. But basically, if your blend type for that layer is set to LB weight blend or height blend, then your layer info should be weight blended layer normal. So that's the one we're going to choose. But before you do so, this is a very important rule to follow. When you create layer info for your very first texture layer, you must select which landscape layer you want to apply this texture layer onto, because your first texture and your first layer info will automatically be assigned to the landscape as your default base layer. So by selecting which layer you want to apply it to, this first texture layer will be placed onto that selected landscape layer. So I'm going to select the base layer. So that's where I want this first initial texture layer be applied to. So with the base layer selected, I'm going to go ahead and click on the plus icon and select our weight blended layer normal, because again, our blend type is set to LB weight blend. A menu will pop up asking us where we want to save that layer information. And by default, it will create a new folder inside the maps folder or inside whichever folder you have your map saved in. And I'm not going to change this, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK and use the defaults. Then wait a few seconds and this grass texture will appear on your entire landscape. And if I come over to our base layer and toggle its visibility, this will show you that this grass texture layer was applied to this base layer. And if your texture doesn't show up automatically and your landscape is still black, select the landscape layer that you want to have this texture be assigned to, and I come down to the target layers, right click on it, and choose fill layer. This will basically fill the entire landscape with this texture and place that texture on the selected landscape layer. For all additional texture layers, you do not need to have a specific landscape layer selected before you create the layer info. That only has to be done for the first texture layer and layer info you create. But for second, third, and fourth, and so on, you don't need to do that. But it does matter when you begin to paint those additional texture layers on your landscape. And I'll show you this in a bit. So as an example, I'm going to select a different layer other than our base. And I come down and we're going to create layer info for the dirt. So I'm going to click on the plus icon and I'm going to choose the same layer info, weight blended layer normal. The same menu will pop up and I'm going to not change anything. It's going to place that layer info in the same folder as the grass layer info. So I'm just going to click OK. And now we have our second layer info created. So the reason it doesn't matter if you select a landscape layer before you create layer info for all additional texture layers is because we actually need to paint that texture information in. And only the first layer gets automatically applied. So now we can begin to paint in the dirt. The first thing you need to do is decide which landscape layer do you want to paint in the dirt texture. And to keep things simple, I'm going to choose the same landscape layer that we have our grass on, our base layer. So I'm going to select it and then left click, hold and drag to begin painting in the dirt. And nothing is happening. That's because first we need to modify our paintbrush settings and increase the intensity. And then we actually need to select the target texture layer that you want to paint with. So I'm going to select the dirt and now I have my landscape layer selected where I want to have this dirt texture to appear on, which is our base landscape layer. And now left click, hold and drag to paint in the dirt texture. So if I disable the visibility of our base landscape layer, you can see that we have the dirt and the grass contained within the same layer. So this is great. Now, what if you want to paint this dirt texture to be contained within a different landscape layer? I'm going to go ahead undo to remove the dirt we just painted. And I want to make sure that I have the dirt target layer selected. That's the texture I want to paint. And then I'm going to select which landscape layer do I want to assign this dirt texture onto. And then I'm going to left click, hold and drag to begin painting the dirt texture. And it is working, but we have a slight problem. We cannot see our full intensity of the dirt texture. So the steps of painting a texture on a different layer is correct. But the problem here has to do with the layer blend type and the layer info we have set for the dirt texture. And you can see if I disable the visibility of our layer 1, we have the dirt texture on it, but it's just not working as it should. So if I select our base layer and paint the dirt in that layer, it will work just fine. That is because we also have our grass texture within that layer, and the grass texture, its blend type is also set to the same blend type and same layer info as the dirt texture. So this is why it's very important to understand the differences between blend types and the differences between two different layer infos. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the dirt texture from our layer 1. I'm going to select layer 1, right click on it, go to clear, paint, and here I can remove all painted textures or just the dirt. So I'm going to go ahead and select the dirt and then click yes. And then we still have our grass and that painted dirt patch within our base layer. So I'm going to go through creating the layer info for our cobblestone and what I would do to fix this issue. I'm going to select the cobblestone layer, and before we can paint textures, we need to assign and create the layer info. So I'm going to select the same one we've been using before, weight blended layer normal. And I'm just going to click OK to create it. And then if I select the base layer and then paint the cobblestone, it will work as it should. This is perfect. I'm going to clear the cobblestone texture from my base layer. But again, if I decide to paint this cobblestone in another landscape layer, this won't produce the effect that I want. We can see right through the cobblestone, so it's not working. So here's how to fix it and how to paint textures in a different, separate landscape layer. I'm going to go ahead and clear this cobblestone from our layer 1. And then I need to go back to the material editor. And I'm going to select all of layer blend nodes I have. And in my case, I have 2. And inside the details panel, I'm going to change the blend type for the texture layer that I want to paint on a separate landscape layer to LB Alpha Blend. The way this blend type works is it allows you to paint textures on top of other textures without blending or removing the textures underneath it, unlike LB Weight Blend or Height Blend, which work very differently in how that texture information is being stored. So basically, changing it to LB Alpha Blend will allow you to paint a texture in a different landscape layer and having it appear correctly. And again, I go more into detail about each of these inside the Landscape Essentials course. So, I have the cobblestone layer, its blend type is set to LB Alpha Blend. I'm going to go ahead and hit apply, save, and let's go back into our map. I'm going to select the cobblestone target layer, that's what I want to paint with, and then I'm going to select the landscape layer where I want to assign this cobblestone texture onto, and it's going to be layer 1. And then paint on the landscape, and it's still not working the way it should, and that is because I need to have this cobblestone layer, its layer info, to be a non-weight blended layer, and currently we have it set to weight blended layer normal. I'm going to go ahead and clear the cobblestone texture from layer 1. And then to update layer info information, go into the content browser. And inside the folder that UE4 created automatically for us when we created the layer info. And then I'm going to double click on the cobblestone layer to open up its properties and enable no weight blend. This will make the cobblestone layer non-weight blended. Then click save, and you can see the layer will now say no weight blend. And if I choose layer 1 now and paint in the cobblestone, it will work as it should. So we have the cobblestone texture on a separate landscape layer, and then we have our grass and dirt on another landscape layer. So we kind of did this backwards where we had to fix what wasn't working. So now you know what happens with your textures when you want to paint them on a separate layer. I'm going to go through this again, but set it up correctly the first time so I don't have to fix it. So I have this rock texture and I want to paint this rock texture on a separate landscape layer. So knowing this ahead of time, I need to go back into the material editor and change the blend type for the rock layer to LB Alpha Blend. Then we need to create layer info, but this time I'm going to choose non-weight blended layer. Save it in the same folder. Then I'm going to select the rock texture layer. I can choose any of the existing landscape layers, but in this case I'm going to create a new landscape layer. Right click on any layer and choose create. Then left click 2 times to rename the layer, and I'm going to name mine rock paint. So with the rock texture layer selected and the new rock paint landscape layer selected, I can now paint to assign this rock texture onto the selected landscape layer, and it will work perfectly and exactly how it should. So now we have the rock texture on its own layer, the cobblestone on its own layer, and then the grass and the dirt on another layer. And one of the benefits here is I can control the alpha, the intensity of the texture within that layer, by lowering this number. So you can control how this texture on this layer appears. And this alpha information is kept separate for the paint and for the sculpt. So if I switch over to paint, and if you remember in the previous video, we had some sculpt information inside the layer 1. I can adjust the alpha value for the sculpt, and I can adjust it for the paint. And they will be independent of each other. So that's very powerful. And as I've showed you, you can clear information on the landscape layer by right clicking on it, going to clear, and you can clear all, meaning the paint and the sculpt, or you can just clear the paint, and then you can clear all painted textures or a specific texture. Another way to clear information on a layer is under target layers. So I'm going to quickly paint the rock back in, and I'm going to make sure that I have this landscape layer selected, and then come down to target layers, right click on the rock and choose clear. And this will also remove that texture from the selected landscape layer. So it's just another way to clear it. And of course you can delete a landscape layer by right clicking on it and choosing delete. But be very careful of doing so, because if that layer also contains some sculpted information, it will be deleted as well. Because again, a single landscape layer can contain sculpted information and painted texture information. And if you delete it, both will be gone. So just be aware of that. Also, each target layer contains an option to enable subtractive blend. And I've experimented and tested this and could not figure out what the use for this is. The documentation explains paint layers each have an additional flag to determine if blending is additive or subtractive. And reading it makes sense, but putting it into practice I just could not understand what the actual use for this would be. So if you know, please leave a comment. Also, one more thing I wanted to bring up. You can see the layer contribution for each texture on a specific layer. Very similar to what I showed you in the sculpt video. If you go to Lit, Visualizers, and enable layer contribution, and then make sure you are under Paint menu. First you need to scroll down to the target layers and select a texture layer. So in this example I'm going to choose the rock. And then scroll up to landscape layers and left click on each layer to select it to see if the rock texture is on that layer and how much of the rock texture is within a specific layer. So this is just a quick way to help you visualize and see which texture is painted on which layer. And then if you want to turn this off, go to Lit, Visualizers, and put it back to normal. Painting textures on landscape layers does get a bit confusing, so to help you get started, I developed some rules to follow and beginner guidelines that will make it easier to start with. So first, are 4 rules to follow for landscape layer painting. Rule number 1. When you create layer info for the very first target layer, be aware which landscape layer you have selected, because you will be assigning that texture to the selected landscape layer. This is only important to do for the first initial layer info. Rule 2. When you paint landscape textures, be aware which landscape layer you have selected, because you will be painting that texture onto the selected landscape layer. Rule number 3. If you are using blend type set to LB weight blend or LB height blend, you must use layer info set to weight blended layer normal, and you have to paint those textures on the same landscape layer. Rule number 4. To paint textures on a different landscape layer, you must set blend type to LB alpha blend, and layer info must be set to non-weight blended layer. And here are some beginner guidelines to follow to make this easier for you. For most of your landscape texture painting, keep everything on a single landscape layer. If you want a texture or textures to be on their own separate layers, make sure that the blend type for their layer texture is set to LB alpha blend inside the material editor, and the layer info is non-weight blended layer. And for any texture that will be on a separate layer, I recommend that you create a new landscape layer just for that texture, because each layer can contain sculpt information and it could also contain texture information. So by separating those two, it will make it easier to manage. If all this information about landscape layers is a bit overwhelming to you, I have a Landscape Essentials course that will help you to get started to create and to sculpt landscapes, as well as how to create landscape materials and how to paint textures on your landscape entirely inside Unreal Engine 4. I highly recommend you take a look at that course and go through the 2 modules. It will make it easier for you to begin using the landscape layers.